42 billion cells are buried inside your skeleton right now. Not on the surface of the bone. Inside it, sealed into tiny chambers in the mineral itself, each one connected to its neighbors by threads so fine they are invisible without an electron microscope. Laid end to end, those connecting channels would run more than 100,000 miles. Every one of those cells is listening. They are not listening for sound, they are listening for bending. For the fraction of a millimeter, your thigh bone flexes when your heel strikes the ground, and, more than that, for how fast it flexes. Those cells hold the vote on whether the skeleton you are standing on gets slightly stronger this year or slightly thinner this year. The vote is taken in fractions of a second, thousands of times a day, entirely without your knowledge, and the result of all that microscopic arithmetic is something very large. It is the difference between a slip on a wet curb at 78 that becomes a bruise and a story, and the same slip that becomes a fractured hip and a hospital bed. Walking is the most common thing anyone over 60 is told to do for their bones. There is a measurement, taken in the wing bone of a turkey in the 1980s, that explains why walking on flat ground does far less for the skeleton than almost anyone believes. That measurement comes later. First, two bodies. What follows is a comparison of two modeled bodies. Neither is a real person. Neither has a name, a history, or a face. Both are constructed from published population data and from measurements taken in laboratories, and they exist here for one reason only, which is to isolate a single variable and watch what that one variable does over time. Everything else about them is held identical on purpose. Both are 64 years old. Both are the same height and the same weight. Both eat roughly the same amount of protein, which is a little under the amount most research suggests an older body needs. Both have vitamin D levels in the normal range. Neither smokes. Neither takes a medication known to affect bone. Neither has a diagnosis of any kind. Both had a bone density scan 2 years ago, and both were told the same thing, which is that the numbers were slightly below the average for a young adult, and to keep active. Both kept active. This matters because the standard story about bone loss is a story about neglect, and neither of these bodies is neglected. Both walk. Both cover a little under 2 miles most days, at a comfortable pace, on flat ground. Pavement, a park loop, a shopping center in bad weather. Both hit somewhere between 8 and 10,000 steps on a good day, and both feel, correctly, that they are doing what was asked of them. Over a year, that is roughly 3 million foot strikes, 3 million separate impacts through the heel, up the shin bone, through the knee, into the neck of the thigh bone where hips break. 3 million loading events per body, identical totals. Now the variable. The variable is not how much, it is not how long, or how far, or how many steps. The variable is how hard and how fast the bone is deformed, and how much of the time it is allowed to sit still afterwards. Body 1 walks. That is the whole loading history. Flat ground, even pace, heel to toe. 3 million times, at a level of force the skeleton has been absorbing without complaint since the 1980s. Body 2 walks exactly the same distance at exactly the same pace, with one difference. A small fraction of that time is spent doing something the bone cannot ignore. Stairs taken briskly instead of slowly. A set of heel raises followed by a controlled drop onto the heels, 20 or 30 of them, done in under 2 minutes while the kettle boils. Once the balance is reliable, a few small hops. Total added time across a whole day, somewhere near 3 minutes. 3 minutes against 90. That is the entire difference between these two bodies. Now watch what happens. 1 week in, nothing is visible from the outside. Both bodies feel the same. Both scales read the same. Inside the bone, the two histories have already stopped resembling each other. Those cells sealed inside the mineral are called osteocytes, and the way they detect load is stranger than it sounds. They do not measure force directly. When a bone bends, the fluid sitting in the microscopic channels around each cell is squeezed from the compressed side toward the stretched side. The cell feels that fluid sliding past it, the way you feel a current in a river against your leg rather than feeling the weight of the water. Fluid moving means load. Fluid still means no load. That single detail explains almost everything that follows, because fluid only moves while pressure is changing. Bend a bone and hold it bent, and within a few seconds the fluid finishes redistributing and stops flowing. The bone is still loaded. The cell has stopped hearing anything. This is why standing all day does nothing for the skeleton. It is not a metaphor. Load applied and held is, to an osteocyte, indistinguishable from no load at all. It also explains why the speed of the load matters so much. Push fluid through a narrow channel slowly and it drifts. Push it through fast and it scrapes. The cell is not registering how much weight arrived. It is registering how violently the fluid was displaced, which depends on how quickly the bone changed shape, not on how heavy the object was. A heavy load applied gently and a light load applied sharply are not equivalent inputs, and the sharp one is the one that speaks. In body 1, each step produces a small, slow rise in fluid flow and a small, slow fall, repeated 3 million times. And here, the second strange property appears, which is that these cells go deaf to repetition. The response to a repeated load is largest in the first handful of cycles and drops away sharply after that. By a few dozen cycles, the signal has flattened. Everything after that is, for practical purposes, silent traffic. In body 2, the same 3 million quiet steps happen. But 2 or 3 times a day, the fluid in those channels is shoved hard and fast, from a standing start, in a body that has been at rest long enough to have reset its sensitivity. Those few seconds are not added to the walking, they are a different category of event entirely. 1 month in, the difference has moved from signaling to chemistry. Bone is rebuilt continuously by 2 crews working in sequence. One crew, the osteoclasts, dissolves a patch of old bone. That takes about 2 to 3 weeks. The other crew, the osteoblasts, lays down new bone in the hole. That takes about 3 months. The asymmetry is the whole problem of aging bone. Removal is fast and filling is slow, so anything that tips the balance even slightly toward removal compounds quietly, month after month, with no symptom of any kind. The osteocytes are the crew chiefs. When they are not being deformed quickly enough, they release more of a protein called sclerostin, which acts as a brake on the bone-building crew. Loading suppresses it. Bed rest raises it. Spaceflight raises it. In body 1, sclerostin sits where it has sat for years, and the brake stays lightly on. In body 2, the same protein is being pushed down 2 or 3 times a day, briefly, and the building crew is released. The evidence that this brake is real does not come from a laboratory dish. It comes from what happens to people who stop loading their skeletons entirely. Put a healthy adult on strict bed rest, and hip density begins falling within weeks, at a rate that would take years to achieve through aging alone. Send a crew into orbit, and the same thing happens faster, at roughly 1% a month at the hip in the early missions, in young, fit, screened people who were exercising daily on board. They were not weak. They were not sedentary. Their bones were simply never deformed, because nothing weighed anything, and the cells reported the only thing they can report. At 1 month, no scan on Earth could tell these 2 bodies apart. The divergence is real and it is chemical, and it is completely invisible. If you have noticed that the person at the doctor's office writes down a height slightly shorter than the one on your driver's license, that a shirt that used to sit right now sits long, that your waistband rides differently even though the scale has not moved, that the top button of a coat feels closer to your chin than it used to, none of that is a diagnosis of anything. But it is one of the very few outward signs that vertebral bone is quietly losing height, and it is the sign most people explain away. 1 year in, the difference becomes measurable, and it is smaller than you would like and larger than it looks. In a study of older men, one group hopped on one leg only, about 50 hops, 5 days a week, for 12 months. Each man's other leg served as his own comparison, which removes almost every confounding factor a study can suffer from. At the end of the year, the neck of the thigh bone on the hopping side had gained bone mineral density. The other hip, in the same body, eating the same food, carrying the same hormones, had not. A fraction of 1% in a year, from 50 hops a day. That number sounds trivial until you set it against the alternative. In the years after menopause, and more slowly in men, untouched bone at the hip drifts down by something in the region of 0.5% to 1% every year. So the gap that opens between body 1 and body 2 in 12 months is not the size of the gain, it is the size of the gain plus the size of the loss avoided. Meanwhile, what does the walking do? Reviews pooling the walking trials in postmenopausal women find a small effect at the hip, inconsistent across studies, and essentially no effect at the spine. Walking is not nothing, but as a signal to bone, it is close to the edge of detectability, and the reason is not that the dose is too small, the dose is enormous. 3 million repetitions is an enormous dose. The reason is that the wrong quantity is being increased. 10 years in, and here the honest thing must be said before the number is, this stretch is extrapolation, not measurement. Nobody has run this comparison for a decade with a control arm. What follows is what the annual rates predict if they simply continue, and biology rarely runs in a straight line. On that arithmetic, Body 1 arrives at 74 with somewhere around 5 to 8% less bone at the hip than it started with. Body 2 arrives with roughly the same amount it had at 64, possibly slightly more. The two are now separated by close to a tenth of their hip bone. That is not an abstraction, because bone strength does not fall in proportion to bone mass. It falls faster than bone mass, since strength depends on how the mineral is distributed around the bending axis, and the material is lost preferentially from the inner surface where the structure is thinnest already. A tenth less bone can mean considerably more than a tenth less strength. Picture the neck of the thigh bone as a tube rather than a rod, because that is what it is. An outer shell of dense bone with a lattice of struts inside it. The lattice thins first, and when a strut is thin past a certain point, it does not simply get weaker. It breaks, and then it is gone, and nothing rebuilds a strut that has no surface left to build on. The shell then thins from the inside outward, so the tube keeps its outer diameter while the wall gets thinner, which is why two hips can look similar on the outside and behave completely differently under a sideways impact. And the consequence of that sits at the far end of a very ordinary sequence of events. A wet floor, a rug edge, a step misjudged in the dark. In one body the hip absorbs it. In the other it does not. And after a hip fracture at that age, a substantial proportion of people never return to walking the way they walked the week before. Same age, same food, same steps, 3 minutes a day. And notice what is missing from that entire 10 years. There was no pain. There was no moment where something felt wrong. If you have found yourself thinking that nothing hurts, that you get around fine, that you would know if something were happening, that reasoning is sound for almost every tissue in the body and completely useless for this one. Bone has no nerve endings inside the mineral. It reports fractures. It does not report thinning. The first sensation most people ever receive from a decade of quiet subtraction arrives at the moment of the break, which is the one moment when the information is no longer of any use. So where exactly did these two bodies separate? Not at 10 years, not at 1 year. They separated inside the first tenth of a second of every step, and to see it you need 1 unit of measurement. Engineers describe deformation in microstrain. 1,000 microstrain means a bone has changed length by 1/10 of 1%. Human bone fractures somewhere around 25,000 microstrain, so everything discussed here is happening in a range far below any risk of breaking anything. A very small number of volunteers in the history of science have had a strain gauge surgically attached to their own shin bone and then gone out and walked, run, and jumped on it. From that handful of measurements, walking on flat ground produces peak strains in the region of 400 to 500 microstrain. Running produces roughly double that. Jumping, landing, and changing direction sharply produce more again, and, more importantly, produce it far faster. Now set that against the model built by the American orthopedic surgeon Harold Frost, who proposed that bone behaves like a thermostat with set points. Below roughly 50 to 100 microstrain, the skeleton reads disuse and begins removing material. Between roughly 200 and 1,000, it reads business as usual and holds steady. Above roughly 1,000 to 1,500, it reads overload and starts adding. Flat walking, at 400 to 500 microstrain, sits squarely in the middle window, not in the disuse zone, nowhere near the building zone. It is exactly, precisely, the level of load that instructs the skeleton to change nothing. And magnitude is only half of it. When those instrumented volunteers moved from walking to running to jumping, the peak strain roughly doubled, while the rate at which the strain was applied rose far more steeply than that. The bone was not only bending further, It was bending further in less time, and the laboratory work consistently finds that the rate of deformation predicts the building response better than the size of it does. A slow, heavy load and a fast, moderate one are not interchangeable, and walking is slow by design. The whole point of an efficient gait is to smooth the impact out. Body 1 has spent 10 years sending the skeleton a message. The message is, "This is enough. Keep what we have." And the skeleton has obeyed, while the background drift of aging quietly removes material underneath the message. The turkey measurement is the piece that ties it together. In the 1980s, Clinton Rubin and Lance Lanyon isolated a section of wing bone in turkeys so that no load reached it except the load they applied themselves. They could then ask a question nobody had been able to ask cleanly, which is how much loading a bone actually needs. The answers overturned the assumption behind every walking recommendation since. First, a static load, pressure applied and held at the same magnitude, produced the same result as no load at all. The bone wasted as though it were doing nothing, because as far as the cells were concerned, it was. Second, 4 loading cycles a day were enough to stop the bone from being lost. Third, 36 cycles a day produced close to the maximum response the bone was capable of. Fourth, and this is the finding that should be printed on the wall of every gym, raising it from 36 cycles to 1800 cycles a day added essentially nothing. The bone had already stopped listening. The extra 1,764 repetitions were, biologically, wasted effort. Bone does not count. It measures amplitude and speed, and then it stops paying attention. Which is why 3 million steps and 50 hops are not on the same scale of comparison. They are answers to 2 different questions. There is a moment in the history of this idea that is worth 2 minutes because the shape of the answer was visible long before anyone understood the cells. In 1867, a German anatomist named Hermann von Meyer published drawings of the inside of the upper thigh bone. Cut lengthwise, the head of the femur is not solid. It is a lattice of fine bony struts, and Meyer noticed the struts were not scattered. They ran in arcs, crossing one another at consistent angles, in a pattern too orderly to be accidental. By the traditional account, Meyer showed these drawings to the Swiss engineer Carl Kuhlmann, who was at that time working out how to calculate the internal stresses in curved structures, such as crane arms. Kuhlmann looked at the anatomy and recognized his own diagrams. The struts inside the human hip followed the same lines that stress follows through a loaded curved beam. An engineer would have had to calculate those lines. The femur had simply grown them. 25 years later, the German surgeon Julius Wolff gathered this and a great deal more into the claim the field has argued about ever since, which is that the form of a bone follows the loads placed upon it. Wolff got much of the detail wrong, particularly the mathematics, but the central observation has survived every attempt to knock it down. Bone is not a fixed scaffold laid down in youth and slowly spent. It is a structure continuously rebuilt in response to the forces it actually receives, which raises the obvious problem for a body in the 21st century, since the forces a modern skeleton actually receives are extraordinarily uniform. Smooth floors, level pavements, lifts, a body that never lands. So which of these 2 bodies are you? The answer does not come from a scan, and it does not come from how much you move. Run through your last 7 days and look for a single category of event, anything at all where you left the ground and came back down, or where a load arrived faster than you could brace against it. Stairs taken 2 at a time, stepping down off a curb harder than intended, carrying something heavy in one hand so the hip on that side had to work. A grandchild jumped on you, a pothole you did not see. For most people, over 60, that list has 0 entries in a normal week, and it is not because of frailty. It is because the environment removed every one of them. Ramps replaced steps, trolleys replaced carrying, and a life got smoother. The second list is easier. Count the hours you spent seated. Then remember that sitting is not the opposite of loading. Holding a position is also not loading. The skeleton has no category for effort. It has a category for change. Now the part where the limits of all this are stated plainly, because the case above is not equally solid at every step. Well established. Osteocytes are the sensors. Fluid movement in the channels around them is the signal. Dynamic loading builds bone, static loading does not, and disuse causes rapid, measurable loss. Bed rest and spaceflight demonstrate the last one beyond argument. Well supported but derived largely from animal work, the specific cycle numbers, 4 cycles, 36 cycles, and the plateau above them come from a bird's wing bone under controlled loading, not from a human hip on a staircase. The pattern of rapid saturation appears again in rodents and in the human trials that exist, but the exact numbers do not transfer species to species. A model, not a law. Frost's thresholds. The idea of set points is widely accepted, and the specific microstrain boundaries are estimates. No clinic can measure where any individual's threshold sits, and it almost certainly shifts with age, hormones, and prior loading history. Weakest, and stated as such, the 10-year projection. Extrapolating annual rates over a decade assumes the rates hold, which they may not. And one honest correction to the framing. Walking is genuinely valuable for the cardiovascular system, for glucose handling, for muscle, for mood, and for balance. And balance prevents falls, and preventing falls prevents fractures far more reliably than bone density does. Walking is not the mistake. Believing that walking has already covered the skeleton is the mistake. So what does the skeleton actually want, stated as an input rather than as a treatment? It wants a load that arrives quickly. Speed of deformation appears to matter at least as much as size of deformation, which is why a landing counts and a slow squat, for bones specifically, counts for much less. It wants very few repetitions, 10 to 50, not 500. Everything past the first few dozen is going to a cell that has already stopped responding. It wants those repetitions broken up. Splitting a set into small groups with a rest between them produces more response than the same number done consecutively, because the sensitivity recovers during the gap. 3 short bouts across a day beat 1 long one. It wants frequency across the week rather than volume in one session, because the signal decays and the building crew works for months on a job that takes seconds to commission. And it wants the load delivered to the site that matters. Bone responds locally, not globally. There is no circulating signal that carries the news from a loaded shin to an unloaded wrist, which is exactly why the hopping study worked as a comparison at all. One hip changed and the other one, in the same bloodstream, did not. So loading the legs does very little for the forearm, and nothing done on your feet loads the spine the way a weight carried in the hands does, because the spine only knows it is being loaded when something is pressing down through it. In practice, that is a very small amount of time. The published human work that has produced real gains looks like this: around 50 hops a day at one site, 5 days a week, or twice weekly supervised high-intensity resistance and impact training, which in postmenopausal women with low bone mass produced spine density gains of around 3% across 8 months, while the comparison group drifted downward. Both of those studies were supervised, screened, and progressed gradually, and that qualifier is not decoration. Impact loading is not appropriate for everyone, and for some people it carries real risk. Anyone with diagnosed osteoporosis, a previous spinal or hip fracture, a joint replacement, significant arthritis, a balance disorder, or unexplained bone pain should not begin impact loading without talking to a doctor first, because the same forces that instruct a healthy skeleton can damage a compromised one. This is an explanation of how bone tissue responds to mechanical input. It is not medical advice, it is not a treatment plan, and it does not replace a conversation with your own physician, who can see your scan and your history and knows which of these forces your skeleton is currently in a position to receive. For a body without those conditions, the smallest honest version is this: somewhere in the day, stand up, rise onto the toes, and drop back onto the heels with control, so the landing arrives through the leg rather than being lowered. A few of those, then walk away and let the cells recover, and do it again later. Not 30 minutes, not 3 million. The skeleton was never designed as a container to be preserved. It is a structure under permanent renegotiation with the ground, rebuilding itself around the forces it actually receives, and it is entirely indifferent to the forces it does not. Julius Wolff wrote it down in 1892, before anyone had seen an osteocyte, before anyone had measured a microstrain, before anyone knew there was fluid moving through channels inside the mineral. Bone, he said, adapts its architecture to the loads placed upon it. A flat pavement places almost none.